Let us start with a simple illustrative example. A lessee leases from a lessor a building for a lease term of 10 years. The lessee will pay $100,000 annually at the end of each year. The interest rate implicit in the lease is not readily determinable. The lessee's incremental borrowing rate is 6%. The right-of-use asset is depreciated over the lease term. Let us account for this transaction, and measure the lease liability and the right-of-use asset, on and after the commencement date. Here is a schedule to calculate the lease liability at the commencement date. The periodic payment as given in the example is $100,000. The lessee's incremental borrowing rate 6%. And the lease term of 10 years. List the years in the first column. And the lease payments in the second column. Calculate the present value for each lease payment. Use this formula to calculate the present value factors. Insert the formula here for the first payment. The rate is 6%, which is the lessee's incremental borrowing rate. 1 for the first year because the first payment will be discounted 1 full year, remember that it is paid at year end. By substituting in the formula, we get the present value factor for the first lease payment. Multiply the lease payment by the present value factor to get the present value for the first lease payment on the commencement date. Fill in the entire schedule to get the present value factors, and the present values for the rest of the lease payments on the commencement date. Sum up the present value column to get the present value of the whole series of lease payments, and this is the carrying amount of the lease liability on the commencement date. Let us move on and calculate the right-of-use asset. One of the components to be included in the measurement of the right-of-use asset on the commencement date is the initial measurement of the lease liability, and we already calculated it. So insert it here. Next, lease payments made on, or before the commencement date. No information was mentioned in the example about any payments made on, or before the commencement date. So, put 0 here. Anyway, we will cover that in the following lecture. The carrying amount for the right-of-use asset on the commencement date is $736,008, same balance for the lease liability. And this is the journal entry that should be booked in the lessee's books on the commencement date. Well, that is for the initial measurement of the lease liability and the right-of-use asset on the commencement date. Now, let us see what happens to the carrying amounts of both the lease liability and the right-of-use asset after the commencement date. Here is the lease amortization schedule with the years of the lease term listed. In this column, we will start with the beginning balance of the lease liability at the commencement date that we calculated here. And this is the beginning balance for the right-of-use asset. The interest charge is the beginning balance of the lease liability multiplied by 6%, and note that this balance is outstanding for the whole year, because the lease payments are made at the year end. Insert the lease payment. The reduction in the carrying amount of the lease liability is the difference between the interest charge and the lease payment. The interest charge is $44,161, and that charge increases the carrying amount of the lease liability. The lease payment of $100,000 decreases the carrying amount of the lease liability, which means that we have a net decrease of $55,839. And this is the carrying amount of the lease liability at the end of year 1. In year 2, we start with the ending balance of the lease liability in year 1, and we repeat what we have done for year 1, so let us complete the rest of the schedule. Here in this column, we have the yearly interest charge that will go to the profit and loss. And in this column, the yearly balances for the lease liability that should appear on the balance sheet at each year end, till it comes to 0 at the end of year 10, the end of the lease term. This is the journal entry that should be booked in the lessee's books at the end of year 1. And that entry is booked every year end with the relevant figures taken from the lease amortization schedule. Now, let us move to the right-of-use asset. The yearly depreciation charge for the right-of-use asset is the cost of the right-of-use asset divided by 10 years, which is the lease term. And this is the ending balance of the right-of-use for year 1. And by completing the schedule, you get the yearly balances for the right-of-use asset, and note that the balance is 0 at the end of year 10, the end of the lease term. And that is the entry that should be booked annually in the lessee's books to recognize the reduction in the carrying amount of the right-of-use asset. In this example, the lease payments were made at the end of each year. Now let us assume that the lease payments are made at the beginning of each year, and see how the calculation of the lease liability and the right-of-use is affected by the change in the timing of lease payments. So back to our schedules, and here are the years in the first column. Then the lease payments in the second column, but note here that the first lease payment is not included in the calculation of the lease liability, as it is already paid at the beginning of year 1, which is the commencement date, and recall that the lease liability by definition, is the present value of the lease payments that are paid after the commencement date, and not on, or before the commencement date. So, ignore the first lease payment here when calculating the lease liability. In the third column, calculate the present value factors for each lease payment, and this formula is used for that, but with a little change here, -1 in the exponent. This formula is used for calculating the present value factors, when the lease payments are made at the beginning of the year. Insert the formula here to get a present value factor for the lease payment in year 2. And here is the present value for the second lease payment on the commencement date. By completing the schedule, we get the carrying amount of the lease liability at the commencement date. The calculation of the right-of-use asset includes, as we said before, the initial measurement of the lease liability. Another component from the components of the right-of-use is the lease payment that was made on, or before the commencement date. Recall that this payment was not included in the calculation of the lease liability. The total of these two figures is the carrying amount of the right-of-use asset on the commencement date. Now let us redo the calculations in the lease amortization schedule. Start with the beginning balance for the lease liability and the right-of-use. The first lease payment is not included, as it was already paid on the commencement date and not after. The interest charge is calculated by multiplying 6% by the carrying amount of the lease liability that was outstanding for the whole year, and this is the difference between the beginning balance of the lease liability less the lease payment made at the beginning of the year, which is 0 for year 1. Multiply it by 6% to get the interest charge for year 1. The reduction in the carrying amount of the lease liability is the interest charge, less the lease payment, which is 0 in year 1, and note here that the carrying amount of the lease liability is not reduced, but is actually increased, and this is only for year 1, because no lease payment was made after the commencement date for the first year. For the second year, the beginning balance of the lease liability is the ending balance for year 1. The lease payment that was made at the beginning of the second year. The beginning balance of the lease liability for the second year less the lease payment made at the beginning of the second year. And the difference is multiplied by 6% to get the interest charge for the second year. The reduction in the carrying amount of the lease liability is the interest charge, less the lease payment. And this is the ending balance of the lease liability for the second year. Let us complete the schedule for the remaining years. And here we are. So, this was a basic overview about the measurement of the lease liability and the right-of-use asset. Now, let us see what components are included in the right-of-use asset, and the lease payments.